So, dear all, as Vaidas already said, welcome to the last but not least session. So it calls Artistic Interpretations of Modernism. And as you already know, the session invites to focus on practices of experimental heritage protection with an emphasis of creativity, invite innovative interventions and non-traditional solutions. Because reinterpretation of historic and cultural values represent modernist heritage as a multicultural and dynamic experience. But you know, actually this topic, the topic of the session is very, very close to the main goal of KONA's 2022 program, Modernism for the Future. You can see the name here. And perhaps yesterday during your excursion you already heard that KONA's status as a temporary capital city from 1919 till 1940s provoked a huge construction boom. More than 6,000 buildings from this period survived until today. And however, many of these places are unloved and in a very poor condition or even abandoned. So we believe that in order to raise the value of our heritage, we need to build up citizens' emotional attachment to it. And by using different forms of heritage, interpretation, we can look for new stories and ways to do so. So I'm actually very excited to start the session and to hear the different examples of modernism interpretation, combining collective memory, innovative placemaking, and other. And I think that actually artistic interpretation is a very important part of our attitude towards cultural heritage in KONAS as well as in other modernist cities. So I'm very honored to welcome Partha Mitter. So he's our keynote speaker of the session, and very few words about him. So Partha is a writer and historian of art and culture, specializing in the reception of Indian art in the West, as well as in modernity, art and identity in India, and more recently in global modernism. At present, he's Emerita Professor in Art History, University of Sussex, member of Wolston College, Oxford, and Honorary Fellow, Victoria and Albert Museum, London. So you're very welcome.
Thank you, Vilter. I feel like a pop singer holding this hand. Okay, we've been talking about future modernism. What's it going to be like in the 21st century? In 2008, I published a paper on decentering modernism, art history, and the avant-garde from the periphery, proposing that recent changes in art history haven't really led to any substantial improvement in the perception of non-Western avant-garde, which is still dismissed as derivative. I must confess, I had dealt entirely with non-Western world in the paper. I didn't include margins within Europe. Mea culpa, but I have a defense. My theoretical proposal was taken up by Russian and Eastern European art historians at St. Petersburg University who were attending college art station in the US. They stated as follows: this panel takes Partha Mitter's argument in decentering modernism as a point of departure in order to rethink how art in these regions can be understood in an increasingly global art history. I want to add a very personal note here. It's with sadness I learnt of the death of Piotr Piotrowski. I met him recently. In 2004, Piotrowski gently rebuked me Mitter's conclusions concern the new art history on the resistance of the colonial world to the dominance of the metropolis. However, he does not mention the tension internal to the so-called metropolis, which has its own centers and peripheries, where the development of modernism should be decentered. Am I all right? I'm not sort of veering too much right and left, okay. I totally agree, but the purpose of my paper is to create a theoretical framework for global decentering of the modernist discourse. And of course this includes Eastern Europe. So today I'm going to focus on non-Western art, my field, but I hope my paper will take the discussion forward. So let's return to today's talk. Why do we need to reimagine modernism from a transcultural perspective? Now, I mention this simply because modernism seems to have become an inclusive global concept today. Indeed, much has changed, especially the emergence of artists from the non-Western world, as the endless rounds of international biennales. Select artists from the periphery are offered as evidence that the modernist art of the West and the rest of the world now share certain common values. I have to not try this. Never good with machine. Ah, you got it. Lovely. Thanks. Okay. Recently, Tate Modern mounted an iconic show that marked a significant departure, a massive exhibition of Ibrahim El-Salahi, the visionary African modernist. Indeed, the heterogeneous character of contemporary global art practices has even given rise to anxiety about the end of art history as a grand Hegelian narrative. In Hans Belting's influential book, The End of Art History, we could therefore say with impunity that the process of dismantling the canon has begun. This is good news. But the bad news is that the change is not only extremely slow, but is also marginal, despite the efforts of a new breed of scholars and curators. Simply put, art history hasn't come to terms with global changes. Therefore, Belting's fear that the canon looks increasingly vulnerable may be somewhat premature. Even today, leading non-Western artists seldom feature in standard art history textbooks. The modernist canon continues to be a closed discourse that tends to erase non-Western art from art history. Witness, for instance, the standard textbook in the US, Art Since 1900, Modernism, Anti-Modernism, Postmodernism, published in 2004. One of the most influential works in recent years. Now, the book contains no reference to notable artists living outside Euro-America who have made significant contribution to global modernity. And yet there have been significant developments in non-Western art in the 20th century. Many of his artists are engaged in creating vital expressions of cultural resistance to colonial hegemony. The savage, spiky images of the great Mexican primitivist Wilfredo Lam, 1902-1982, is totally ignored. The remarkable Indian painter Jamini Roy, 1887-1972, his innovative formalism based upon reimagining the folk art of India, powerfully mediated between the global and the local. is hardly known in the West. Such marginalization is usually explained in terms of derivativeness of non-Western art, a judgment that continues to exert its power in representations of the art of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Now, I would sound a note of caution. The neglect of regions outside the West isn't a conspiracy. It's simply a reflection of a wider epistemic problem, the common practice of identifying Western norms with universal values. Inspired by Immanuel Kant's a priori view of aesthetics, the concept art is often regarded as neutral and disinterested. However, it systematically ignores the implications of race, gender, sexual orientation, and class in art history. Therefore, in order to grasp this problem, we need to probe more closely the universal nature of the Western canon, originating in the Enlightenment. This deep-seated hierarchy, implicit in the modernist discourse, and its impact on regions of the so-called periphery, can only be explained in historical terms. The rise of art history as a discipline went hand in hand with European expansion overseas. The colonial powers sought to impose good taste in the subject nations through academic naturalism and classical standards of taste. Who better than Leonardo? Now, we cannot deny that in the late 19th century, the Modernist Revolution in the West, spearheaded by the avant-garde, seriously challenged academic art, and hardly any part of the globe remained immune to this clarion call. Nonetheless, the discipline of art history is yet to question, with any seriousness, the implicit acceptance of non-Western modernism as derivative. Two cases highlight the glaring contrast in art historical judgments on the role of influence. The first is the famous exhibition, Primitivism in 20th Century Art, Affinity of the Tribal and the Modern, held at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1985. The second is what I have called the Picasso-Manqué syndrome, about which I shall speak shortly. The MoMA exhibition claimed to highlight the formal similarities between ethnographic art and Western modernism. For instance, describing the primitive motives in the works of Picasso as a reflection of the accidental affinities between modern and tribal art that transcended time and space. The curators couldn't accept that the artistic borrowings of Picasso from simple, so-called primitive cultures could amount to a cultural debt. My second example, the servant from Africa, they, always thought of it, my second example is an Indian modernist, Gaganendra Tagore, 1867, 1938. He was the first Indian to adapt the revolutionary syntax of Cubism to produce a series of small jewel-like paintings between the years 1921-1928. Now, let's take analytical Cubism, developed around 1909-1911 by Picasso and Georges Braque, that rapidly spread worldwide. To give you an example of Picasso, with contradictory light sources, that objects could be dissolved, thus destroying Renaissance illusionism. Interestingly, artists everywhere else were drawn more to Cubism, flexible, non-figurative syntax, which could be put to different usage. The formal revolution of analytical Cubism was less appealing, like this one was your Grosch, the funeral of Capit. Now, the motivation behind Western expressionists such as Grosch and the Indian artist Govardhan Tagore was similar. Objects could be distorted and fragmented to produce dazzling patterns. So, Panitsa, sorry. So that's Govardhanath. Now, although these artists share a formal global language, the specific cultural context of Grosch and Govardhanath were, of course, very different, as were their artistic objectives. They simply reflected the decontextualizing tendency of modernity, shared by both the center and the periphery. Styles, past and present, could be appropriated to generate strikingly new meanings. Yet, according to the English art historian W.G. Archer, Picasso's use of African sources didn't compromise his integrity as a European artist, while Govardhanath's use of Cubism resulted in the loss of self as a colonial hybrid. Archer, in fact, represents the complex discourse of power, authority, and hierarchy involved in the assessment of the non-Western avant-garde. So I call this the Picasso-Monkey syndrome. Successful imitation is a form of aping. Imperfect imitation represents a failure of learning. Now, we needn't interpret these cross-cultural exchanges of ideas and technology as a product of domination and dependence. Since the ancient times, cross-fertilization of cultures, including artistic styles, has been a fact of history. Modernism in Asia, Africa, and Latin America could thus be studied as part of the global process of cultural exchange. So, how can we reconfigure art history for the present century? Let me unpack one of the key concepts in art history: influence. Stylistic influence acquired a special significance for colonial art historians who were obsessed with tracing the Western grammar of non-Western modernisms and ranking them within an imagined world order. Yet influence tends to diminish artistic agency in the production of art. Artists matter more than their sources. Pages. Just 1 second. Right. The modernist canon, however, embraces a great deal more. Its linear history constructs a whole world of inclusions and exclusions. This is a long tradition, going back to the Renaissance. Giorgio Vasari defined Florence, Rome, and Venice as centers of innovation, categorizing other regions of Italy as sites of delayed growth and imitation. Vasari's notion of center and periphery was taken further by the German art historian Winkelmann in the late 18th century. He took climatic, national, and racial differences in art as objective facts. Of course, modernism rebelled against academic art, but despite its revolutionary credentials, it used the originary discourse of the metropolis to marginalize other modernisms as suffering from a time lag. Center-periphery relationship is not one of geography, but of power and authority, with modernism creating its own tacit exclusions and inclusions. So if we discard style as a meaningful tool, what other categories can we deploy to make sense of the transmission of ideas across culture that aren't dependent on center-periphery imbalance? Politically speaking, the rise of BRICS countries and of Asian tigers and the shifting balance of power has had a massive impact on the art market. But apart from the geopolitical argument, which isn't trivial, are there any intellectual justifications for the center to recognize the periphery? I think for that we need to readjust our mindset. Colonial discourse regards cultural intersections as a linear process. Let me give you my favorite analogy. I see this as a waterfall, ideas from the West forever flowing downwards to the rest. But in fact, the confluence of multiple cultural streams has been known fact of history. Recent critical art histories have offered strategies for empowerment through new readings of modernism in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The academic subject, visual culture in particular, seeks to erase the distinction between high art and so-called applied art, because it tends to reinforce global inequality in power relations. Others plead for a more open discourse that would embrace plurality and uneven edges, and for bringing within art history critical voices from the periphery. The most exciting aspect of modernisms across the globe is their plurality, heterogeneity, and difference. Nestor Garcia Canclini proposes multi-temporal heterogeneities, while Gerardo Mosquera opts for the notion of a decentralized international culture. Mosquera argues that the peripheries are emerging as multiple centers of cultural production, even as they strengthen local developments in a constant process of hybridization. Now, these are persuasive notions, especially the concept of hybridity. But what about those artists in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, for whom resistance to colonial art has been predicated on an assertion of national identity? How do we judge Diego Rivera, for instance? The notion of hybridity may not apply here, and I would propose some other means of studying the historically grounded production and consumption of art. But our first task, an urgent task, is to dismantle the teleology of modernism and stop viewing Western modernism as a universal category that is beyond time and space. The great achievements of Western modernism can be treated historically within its own set of conventions. That's not to say that its experience has not enriched other traditions. So without privileging any art in particular, and not even Western modernism, we may investigate art practices in their social and cultural settings, taking into account the peculiar contextual needs of regional artistic milieu, the local assertions of global concerns. An inflected narrative of global modernity thus offers us a possible way of restoring the artist's agency in the context of world colonial order by analyzing art practices as a cultural document that's rooted in its context. Indeed, one serious criticism of influence as an analytical tool is that it views artists as passive agents of transmission rather than as active subjects with the ability to exercise choice. My own particular field is called modernism in India. I've tried to show, again back to Jamni Roy, I've tried to show that history can be meaningfully charted within the context of nationalist resistance to the British Empire. Finally, I'd like to propose a theoretical framework that I have been developing for some time. I call it the concept of the virtual cosmopolis, an imaginary world of cultural transaction. What do I mean by the term virtual cosmopolis? Let's examine this further. The political theorist, yesterday somebody mentioned, Benedict Anderson, argues in connection with nationalism that print culture created imagined communities whose members had no direct contact with one another, but shared a common social or intellectual space. What he's referring to, in fact, is the modern communication revolution in the form of print culture. I want to apply Anderson's concept of the imagined community to a global situation. European expansion gave rise to a series of colonial port cities whose elites in distant Calcutta, Shanghai, or Buenos Aires became the agents of modernity. Colonial elites communicated with the center and periphery through major, what I call hegemonic languages: English, French, Spanish, and above all through print culture, texts and images that circulated globally. I call this global exchange of knowledge as a form of virtual cosmopolitanism. Now, we all know that a cosmopolitan is a cultured, well-traveled individual who is open to the world. The virtual cosmopolitan, on the other hand, probably has no means of traveling abroad. Nonetheless, he too is open to global ideas. He or she is an armchair traveler and part of a hybrid imagined community that exchanges ideas between center and periphery on the level of imagination. Now, of course, one cannot ignore the problem of power and authority that confers visibility. Nonetheless, asymmetrical geopolitics doesn't preclude the fecund cross-fertilization of ideas. In short, I could apply the notion of the virtual cosmopolitan to argue that reception of Western ideas in the colonized countries was an active process that centered on the agency of the colonized. This process enables us to understand the spread of modernism on the margins. But what theoretical underpinnings can we deploy to make sense of these cultural exchanges that aren't prejudged by the stigma of derivativeness, the Picasso-Monque syndrome? The Russian critic Mikhail Bakhtin coins the term dialogic to describe a continuous dialogue with other works of literature. The process appropriates the texts of others and transforms them according to one's creative intentions. This intertextual process is dynamic and is engaged in endless redescriptions of one's Weltanschauung. The concept that Bakhtin applies to literary texts could be our useful tool for the cross-cultural analysis of visual art. The particular merit of this dialogic method is that it allows for the coexistence of different approaches in a relativist way. It doesn't set up an essentialist hierarchy of ideas and values. This also accords well with the hybrid and multifaceted cosmopolitanism in the sense that the received foreign text, interpreted in the light of one's text, sets up a dialogical relationship between the global and the vernacular within a cosmopolitan framework. Information and communication revolution enabled intellectuals in the East and the West to discover each other's cultural products, such as art, philosophy, and literature, giving rise to a new global community that engaged in creating the hybrid, multipolar, universal modernity. Just to remind you, I've been suggesting ways of challenging the dominance of the modernist canon in studying non-Western art. Now, instead of taking all ideas that emanate from the West, why don't we look at such virtual encounters as a product of reciprocity? Now, we constantly read about westernization from Asia and Africa, which is part of school book history. All boys have read it, and girls as well. But there are indeed many examples of East-West exchanges. I don't have time to elaborate on this, but just to touch briefly on one major example. The reception of Indian metaphysics in 19th century America. The American transcendentalists Walt Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Henry David Thoreau were engaged in creating a new intellectual tradition based on their reading of Indian sacred texts, the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. It was part of the aim of freeing themselves from the limitations of European positivism. While American philosophers looked to the East, Indian thinkers were turning towards the Enlightenment. To put it in a nutshell, both Indian and American intellectuals were operating in a virtual cosmopolis that generated a mode of dialogic conversation across culture. Therefore, we need to study the reception of Indian philosophy among Americans, not in isolation. Response to exogenous ideas by both Americans and Indians were really two sides to the same global coin. Now, I'm conscious of time's constraint, I'll just summarize. I've discussed various approaches to non-Western modernism from a global perspective, including notions of hybridity and multiple centers of innovation. But my main point is we need to discard the notion of stylistic influence and challenge the asymmetrical relationship between center and periphery. So that is why I propose the theory of virtual cosmopolis as a global discourse that helps explain the reception of modernism in the non-West against the background of colonial hegemony. This process offers a non-hierarchical approach to new ideas, transforming them according to one's own context. Just to end with... No, don't worry. The last one. Okay. Only with such an artist of the future will painters such as Wilfredo Lam or Jamini Roy receive full recognition.